The geographical isolation of Blackwood Manor was absolute, a sprawling cotton estate situated deep within the swamplands of western Alabama, accessible only by a single dirt road that frequently disappeared under the rising waters of the Tombigbee River. In 1855, the estate was a kingdom unto itself, ruled by the Van Holt family, whose wealth was built on the relentless labor of 300 enslaved souls and a reputation for extreme privacy that bordered on paranoia. The architecture of the main house reflected this fortress mentality, with high brick walls and heavy draperies that remained drawn even during the brightest hours of the day, creating a permanent twilight where secrets could fester without the intrusion of the outside world. Into this atmosphere of stifling humidity and silence arrived Arthur Pendleton, a 28-year-old tutor from Boston, hired to educate the family's youngest heir, Conrad Van Holt. Pendleton's journals, which serve as the primary window into this macabre mystery, describe his arrival not as a welcome, but as an entry into a mausoleum where the air felt thick with unspoken tensions. He notes in his first entry the peculiar absence of laughter or conversation, replaced by the omnipresent scratching of insects and the distant rhythmic chanting of the workers in the fields, a sound that he described as the heartbeat of a dying beast. The interior of the manor was dominated by portraits of the Van Holt lineage, a visual catalogue of stern men with a distinct, piercing gaze that seemed to follow observers down the dimly lit corridors. Pendleton's early observations focus heavily on the patriarch, Silas Van Holt, a man in his late 60s whose physical frailty was masked by a tyrannical presence that commanded total obedience from both his family and his property. Silas spent his days in the library, surrounded by genealogical charts and books on animal husbandry, obsessed with the concept of pure bloodlines and the preservation of superior traits, a pseudoscience that he applied with chilling rigor to every living thing on his land. It was in this library that Pendleton first encountered the woman who would become the center of the estate's horrifying collapse, a figure whose name appears in the ledgers with an appraisal value of 0. Cora was technically a house servant, yet Pendleton records his shock at seeing her dressed in silk gowns that had belonged to Silas's late wife, moving through the house with a silent authority that contradicted her legal status. She was described as possessing a beauty that was unsettling in its perfection, with a composure that seemed to absorb the anxiety of the men around her, acting as a calm center in a house built on volatility. Pendleton's diary reveals his confusion regarding Cora's position, noting that she performed no menial labor and was never spoken to with the harsh commands directed at others in bondage. Instead, she existed in a strange, liminal space, neither family nor servant, hovering in the background of dinner parties and family meetings like a ghost that refused to be exorcised. The tutor observed that the men of the house, Silas, his son Julian, and the grandson Conrad, watched her with a mixture of possessiveness and reverence that made the air in the room heavy and difficult to breathe. The social structure of Blackwood Manor was a tangled web of resentments, with 3 generations of Van Holt men living under one roof, each vying for dominance while being bound together by financial interdependence. Silas controlled the money, Julian controlled the daily operations of the plantation, and Conrad represented the future, though he was viewed by his elders as weak and unworthy of the name. Pendleton notes that the only time these 3 men seemed to align was in their interactions with Cora, a unified front of obsession that suggested she was the only asset they truly valued. The isolation of the estate meant that there were few visitors to witness the strange dynamics at play, allowing the family to construct their own reality, unchecked by social norms or legal scrutiny. The nearest town was 20 miles away, and the local doctor, a man named Dr. Thorne, was the only outsider permitted to cross the threshold, usually to attend to private matters that were never discussed in polite society. Pendleton's writing conveys a growing sense of claustrophobia, a feeling that the swamp was slowly encroaching on the house, cutting off any escape from the drama unfolding within its walls. As the weeks turned into months, Pendleton began to notice anomalies in the household records, specifically in the lists of those born and raised in the quarters behind the main house. There were children listed with vague descriptions, their parentage left blank or obscured by ink blots, a chaotic record-keeping that stood in stark contrast to the meticulous logs of cotton yields and livestock births. It was as if a separate shadow population existed on the plantation, one that the Van Holts were desperate to document for themselves, but equally desperate to hide from the census takers and tax assessors. The first block of the narrative concludes with Pendleton's discovery of the 1855 probate inventory draft sitting on Silas's desk, a document that would become the key to understanding the horror. In it, Cora is listed not among the high-value house servants, but in a separate category at the very bottom, valued at $0, with a handwritten note in the margin that read, "Inalienable from the estate, to remain in perpetuity." Now this legal paradox, property that has no value but cannot be sold, was the first thread Pendleton pulled, unaware that it would unravel a tapestry of moral corruption that had been woven over 3 generations of silence. The first crack in the facade of Blackwood Manor appeared to Pendleton not through a document, but through a visual impossibility he witnessed in the walled garden in the spring of 1848, a memory he recounted later in his 1855 journals. He describes looking out from the schoolroom window and seeing a young boy, approximately 7 years old, running through the meticulously manicured rose bushes, a place strictly forbidden to the enslaved children of the quarters. The boy, known as Elijah, was dressed in clean linen rather than the rough-spun cotton typical of his station, and he moved with a confidence that suggested he knew he was untouchable within the perimeter of those brick walls. What struck Pendleton was not the boy's presence, but the way the patriarch, Silas Van Holt, interacted with him, a scene that defied every social convention of Alabama in the mid-19th century. Silas did not raise his cane to strike the child for trespassing. Instead, he sat on a stone bench, watching the boy with a predatory intensity, correcting his posture and tilting his chin to catch the afternoon light. It was a tableau of instruction, indistinguishable from a father teaching a son, yet silence reigned between them, a heavy, suffocating quiet that Pendleton found more disturbing than any shout of anger. When the boy turned his face toward the window, Pendleton froze, for he saw a face that was a biological mirror of the portrait of Silas hanging in the main hall. It was not merely a resemblance, it was a replication of the patriarch's features cast in bronze. The same aquiline nose, the same sharp jawline, and most chillingly, the distinctive Van Holt eye. This genetic anomaly, known as heterochromia, manifested as one eye being deep brown and the other a piercing pale green, a trait so rare it served as the undeniable seal of the dynasty. The existence of Elijah was an open secret within the house, a living testament to a violation that had occurred 7 years prior, yet he was treated with a bizarre mixture of reverence and erasure. He was housed in a small room adjacent to the kitchen, separate from the quarters, but barred from the family wing, existing in a solitary confinement of privilege. Pendleton noted that the other enslaved workers avoided the boy, averting their gaze as if looking at him was to look directly into the sun, fearing the power of the blood that ran in his veins. The anomaly deepened when Pendleton attempted to discuss the boy's education with Silas, assuming that a child of such obvious lineage might be granted some instruction. Silas's reaction was cold and immediate, stating that one does not teach a mirror to speak, its purpose is only to reflect, a cryptic statement that chilled the tutor to the bone. This dehumanization, even in the face of shared blood, revealed that to Silas, Elijah was not a son but a specimen, a successful experiment in the preservation of his own image within a vessel he owned completely. Further investigation into the Plantation's birth records from 1841 revealed that Elijah's birth was recorded with a level of detail usually reserved for prize thoroughbreds, including the exact time, weather conditions, and measurements. The entry for the father was left blank, but in the column for remarks, Silas had written a single word: retention. This clinical terminology applied to a human child suggested a terrifying worldview where biology was an asset to be managed and the human soul was an irrelevance to be discarded. The tension regarding Elijah escalated when visitors came to the manor, prompting the family to lock the boy away in the cellar to prevent the scandal of his face from being seen by the county's polite society. Pendleton describes the muffled sounds of the child crying from beneath the floorboards while the family drank tea in the parlor, a dissonant harmony of clinking porcelain and suppressed misery. It was a performance of normalcy that required the literal burial of the truth, a ritual that the Van Holts performed with practiced ease. Cora's relationship with Elijah was equally fraught, monitored constantly by Silas, who allowed her to feed and bathe the boy, but forbade any displays of excessive mothering that might spoil his disposition. Pendleton observed Cora watching her son from across the room, her face a mask of terrifying stoicism, her hands gripping her apron until the knuckles turned white. She was forced to witness her child being molded into a living artifact of the man who owned them both, a cruelty that surpassed physical pain. This block concludes with a diary entry where Pendleton realizes that the Van Holt eye was not just a quirk of nature, but a curse that marked the child as property of the blood. He writes of a nightmare where the green eye of the boy grew until it swallowed the entire house, a subconscious recognition that this biological marker was the seed of the estate's destruction. The discovery of Elijah was the first documented anomaly, but it was merely the prologue to a much darker pattern of replication that was already underway. The narrative shifts to the year 1850, marking the return of Julian Van Holt, Silas's 40-year-old son, who came back to Blackwood Manor after a decade of failed ventures and squandered wealth in Europe. Julian arrived bitter and humiliated, a man who had failed to carve out his own identity and was now forced to crawl back to the tyranny of his father's purse strings. His resentment was palpable, radiating through the house like a fever, and Pendleton records that the atmosphere at the dinner table became a minefield of passive-aggressive silence and thinly veiled insults. Julian's hostility was initially directed at his father, but his gaze soon drifted to the only object in the house that Silas seemed to value more than his gold: Cora. Pendleton's journals describe a sickening shift in the household dynamic as Julian began to stalk the corridors, watching Cora with a mixture of lust and vindictive calculation. It became clear that possessing her was not just about physical desire, but about taking something that belonged to his father, a proxy war of dominance fought over the body of a woman who had no voice in the matter. The accumulation of anomalous evidence began in earnest when Pendleton noticed the subtle changes in Cora's routine, the way she was summoned to Julian's quarters at irregular hours under the guise of domestic duties. The servants whispered in hushed tones about the nightly duty, a euphemism for the systematic violation that was taking place with the tacit approval, or at least the willful ignorance, of the patriarch. Silas, in his arrogance, seemed to view Julian's actions as a rightful exercise of ownership, failing to see the chaotic rivalry it would spawn. In late 1851, the inevitable consequence of this nightly duty manifested. Cora was with child again. The pregnancy was met not with shame, but with a bizarre competitive anticipation between father and son, as if they were awaiting the results of a wager. Pendleton notes that the tension in the house grew so thick that the very air seemed to vibrate, with Silas watching Cora's expanding form with a critical, almost jealous eye, while Julian preened with a grotesque sense of accomplishment. The child, a girl named Lydia, was born in the sweltering heat of August, and immediately the curse of the Van Holt bloodline made itself known. Even as a newborn, the infant bore the unmistakable Van Holt eye, one brown, one green, marking her undeniably as a product of the dynasty. However, unlike Elijah, who was a carbon copy of Silas, Lydia possessed the softer, brooding features of Julian, a precise biological imprint of the second generation stamped onto the victim. The existence of Lydia created a surreal domestic horror. A brother and sister, Elijah and Lydia, living in the shadows of the house, fathered by a father and his son, sharing a mother who was enslaved to both. Pendleton describes seeing the two children sitting together on the back porch, a visual timeline of the family's predation, their faces serving as living portraits of the men who claimed to own them. The Van Holt eye stared out from both faces, a mocking reminder of the inescapable loop of their lineage. Pendleton's diary entries from this period become increasingly erratic, his handwriting reflecting his deteriorating mental state as he struggled to comprehend the moral vacuum of the household. He records an incident where Julian held the baby Lydia up to the light, not to coo at her, but to inspect her eyes, declaring with satisfaction, "She is my stamp," reducing his daughter to a document of authenticity. It was a declaration of ownership that bypassed affection entirely, rooting itself in the cold soil of narcissism. The accumulation of evidence was not limited to the children. It was written in the ledgers of the plantation itself. Pendleton discovered that Julian had begun to falsify the plantation's accounts to pay for gifts for Cora, silks, perfumes, silver mirrors, items that she accepted with a terrifying lack of emotion. These were not tokens of love, but tributes demanded by a conqueror, and Cora's acceptance of them was a survival strategy, a way to navigate the treacherous currents between the two men who held her life in their hands. This section ends with a chilling observation from Pendleton. The rivalry between Silas and Julian had nothing to do with morality and everything to do with copyright. They were fighting over who had the right to replicate themselves through Cora, treating her womb as a printing press for their own egos. The accumulation of these anomalous children was not an accident, but a project, and the house was beginning to fill with the ghosts of the living. By 1853, Arthur Pendleton had ceased to be merely a tutor and had become a silent chronicler of the monstrosity unfolding around him, driven by a need to rationalize the irrational. Sitting in his cramped room by candlelight, he began to formulate a hypothesis to explain the behavior of the Van Holt men, a theory that moved beyond simple lust or cruelty. Reviewing his notes on Silas's lectures and Julian's outbursts, he concluded that the driving force of the dynasty was a pathological narcissism so profound it bordered on insanity. Pendleton wrote, "They do not love Cora. They do not even see her. They see only the mirror she provides." This Narcissus theory posited that the Van Holt men were incapable of loving any being that did not reflect them, and Cora's unique genetic makeup, or perhaps simply her pliability as property, made her the perfect canvas. They were not seeking a partner or even a pleasure object. They were seeking biological immortality, a way to see their own faces staring back at them, stripped of the judgment that came from the outside world. The hypothesis gained weight as Pendleton observed the interactions between the men and their natural children. There was no affection, no play, no parental warmth. Instead, there was inspection and correction. Silas would spend hours adjusting Elijah's stance to match his own, while Julian would dress Lydia in colors that complemented his own wardrobe. They were curating a living museum of themselves, using the children as mannequins to display the superiority of their bloodline, completely blind to the horror of their forbidden proximity. This theory also explained the baffling paradox of Cora's treatment, why she was kept in silk and spared from labor, yet denied freedom. To free her would be to break the mirror. To treat her as a common field hand would be to tarnish the frame. She was the biological vault of the family, the keeper of the pattern, and her value lay entirely in her ability to produce these high-fidelity copies of her oppressors. Pendleton realized with a shudder that Cora understood this role perfectly, and was using it as her only shield against destruction. The source material for this hypothesis came from a series of letters Pendleton intercepted, written by Julian to a friend in New Orleans. In them, Julian bragged not about a mistress, but about establishing a legacy that cannot be diluted by inferior stock. He spoke of his project with clinical detachment, confirming Pendleton's suspicion that the abuse was being framed in their minds as a pseudo-scientific endeavor, a purification of the race through the concentration of their own noble traits. Pendleton also noted the role of isolation in this psychosis. Cut off from the correcting influence of society, the Van Holt's vanity had grown unchecked, like a fungus in the dark. In the absence of peers to challenge them, they had turned inward, devouring their own household to feed their egos. The first hypothesis was that Blackwood Manor had become a closed system, a self-consuming loop where the only reality was the will of the master, and the only valid face was the one in the mirror. The tutor's analysis extended to the silence of the surrounding community. He hypothesized that the neighbors stayed away not just because the Van Holts were private, but because the aura of wrongness radiating from the estate was palpable. The human instinct detects when the natural order is being subverted, and the collection of look-alike children in the Van Holt garden was a subversion of the highest order. The hypothesis suggested that the isolation was both self-imposed and a quarantine by the outside world. A pivotal moment for this theory occurred when Pendleton witnessed an argument between Silas and Julian, where Silas shouted, "You are diluting the vintage," referring to Julian's influence on the lineage program. It was the language of livestock management applied to their own grandchildren, a slip of the tongue that laid bare the grotesque mechanism of their thinking. They were farming themselves, and Cora was the soil. The block concludes with Pendleton's terrifying realization that this pattern would not end with Julian. He looked at his student, the young Conrad, and saw the same seed of vanity taking root. If the hypothesis held true, the cycle would demand a third iteration, and the tragedy was destined to repeat itself with mathematical precision. The theory was no longer just an explanation, it was a prophecy. The year 1854 brought the coming of age of Conrad Van Holt, the 19-year-old legitimate grandson, an event that marked the beginning of the final social fracture at Blackwood Manor. Conrad was a pale, indecisive young man, suffocated by the looming shadows of his father and grandfather, desperate to carve out a space for himself in a house that had no room for weakness. Pendleton's diary describes Conrad as a hollow vessel waiting to be filled with the family poison, a youth whose insecurity made him dangerous. The coming-of-age celebration was intended to be a grand affair, a reintroduction of the Van Holts to Alabama society, but the records show a dismal turnout. Invitations sent to prominent families in Mobile and Montgomery were declined with polite but firm excuses, a collective shunning that stung the family's pride. The few neighbors who did attend left early, unsettled by the presence of the ghost children, who were imperfectly hidden in the upper gallery, peering down at the guests with those unmistakable eyes. This rejection by their peers drove the family deeper into isolation and accelerated the internal rot. Conrad, humiliated by the failure of his debut, turned his frustration toward the only target available to him, the household. He began to mimic the behaviors of Silas and Julian, barking orders at the servants and adopting a swagger that didn't fit his narrow frame. But most disturbingly, his gaze began to settle on Cora, the woman who was the property of his ancestors, the center of the family's dark gravity. Pendleton records the escalation of Conrad's obsession in a series of disturbing entries. He found sketches in Conrad's Latin workbook, not of classical ruins, but of Cora's face, drawn with a feverish, obsessive hand. The drawings emphasized her eyes and her silence, capturing the allure that had entrapped the 2 generations before him. It was a visual confession that the Narcissus virus had jumped to the 3rd host. Conrad sought to possess Cora, not for herself, but to prove he was a Van Holt man, equal to his father and grandfather. The social fracture deepened within the house as the servants began to silently rebel against the rising tension. Tools were misplaced, meals were served cold, and a palpable air of sullen resistance settled over the quarters. They knew what was coming. The cycle was repeating, and their silent judgment weighed heavily on the manor. Pendleton notes that Cora herself seemed to withdraw further into her stoicism, a statue turning to stone to survive the coming storm. Conrad's pursuit of Cora was a grotesque parody of courtship, played out in the corridors and shadowed corners of the estate. He would corner her, stammering demands that oscillated between pleading and threatening, trying to wield authority he didn't possess. Cora, 32 years old and hardened by years of survival, managed him with a terrifying calm, neither yielding nor openly defying, walking a razor's edge that kept Pendleton awake at night with worry. The turning point of this fracture occurred when Julian caught Conrad staring at Cora, and instead of reprimanding him, laughed. A cruel, mocking sound that stripped Conrad of his dignity. "You are not man enough for the burden of this house," Julian sneered, a challenge that ignited a fuse in the boy's mind. To prove his father wrong, to prove his manhood, Conrad felt he had to claim the ultimate prize of the estate. The abuse was no longer just about pleasure or vanity. It was a rite of passage. Pendleton's attempts to intervene were met with cold dismissal. When he suggested to Silas that Conrad should be sent away to university in the north to escape the stifling atmosphere, Silas refused, stating, "The boy must learn to master his inheritance here." The inheritance was not the land, but the domination of the people on it. The refusal to let Conrad leave sealed the fate of the family, locking the 3 predatory men in a cage with their prey. This section concludes with the horrifying inevitability of the act. In late 1854, the diary records a night of storm and shouting, followed by a silence that was heavy with consequence. The next morning, Conrad walked the halls with a new, dark arrogance, and Cora did not appear for breakfast. The social fracture was complete. The family had cannibalized its own moral restraints, and the 3rd seal had been broken. In the sweltering July of 1855, the irrefutable evidence of the family's total corruption arrived with the birth of a 3rd child, a boy named Samuel. The arrival of this infant shattered the fragile pretense of order that had sustained the manor, presenting a biological reality that was mathematically and morally grotesque. Samuel was the son of the grandson, born to the same woman who had borne children to the father and the grandfather. The genealogy of the house had collapsed into a circle, a snake eating its own tail, creating a web of relations so tangled it defied the laws of God and man. Samuel's appearance was the final, crushing proof. He did not look like Silas, nor did he look like Julian. He bore the unmistakable, weak-chinned, wide-eyed visage of Conrad. The Van Holt face had replicated itself for the 3rd time, stamped onto the innocent flesh of a newborn. Pendleton writes of seeing the baby and feeling a wave of nausea, realizing that the three children, Elijah, Lydia, and Samuel, were half-siblings to each other, yet their fathers were father, son, and grandson. It was an abomination that could not be catalogued. The impact of Samuel's birth on the household was catastrophic. The silence that had once protected the family's secrets curdled into a toxic paranoia. The neighbors, who had already distanced themselves, now severed all ties completely. Rumors had breached the walls. Whispers of the devil's brood at Blackwood Manor circulated in the town. Stories of a house where time and blood flowed backwards. The doctor, Thorne, came to deliver the child and left without speaking a word, his face pale, refusing even the customary glass of sherry. Inside the house, the existence of the three children created a living hell of jealousy and confusion. Silas looked at Samuel with disgust, seeing the weakness of his grandson reflected in the baby. Julian viewed the child as a threat, a sign that his son was usurping his position. Conrad, conversely, was fiercely, delusionally proud, parading the infant in private as proof of his virility, blind to the tragedy he had perpetuated. Pendleton records the surreal horror of the nursery, where the three children lay, an uncle who was a child, a sister who was a niece, and a nephew who was a brother. The definitions of family had been obliterated. Cora moved among them like a sleepwalker, tending to the needs of this impossible brood with a mechanical efficiency that masked a breaking heart. She was the only link between them, the nexus of the tragedy, bearing the weight of 3 generations of sin. The irrefutable evidence extended to the family's behavior. They ceased to dress for dinner. They stopped attending church. The pretense of civilization fell away, revealing the raw, animalistic territoriality beneath. Arguments erupted over trivialities, masking the deeper rot. They were trapped in the house with the living proof of their crimes, and the mirrors they had created were now reflecting a truth too ugly to bear. Pendleton's diary from this time is filled with talk of leaving, of fleeing back to Boston, but he found himself paralyzed by a morbid fascination and a sense of responsibility to the history being written. He felt he was the only witness to a biblical collapse, a modern-day fall of the House of Usher. He began to hide his journals, fearing that if the Van Holts knew he was documenting their descent, his life would be worth nothing. The documented impact reached its zenith when Silas ordered that the children be kept entirely out of sight, even from the house staff. He wanted to erase the visual evidence, to shove the truth back into the dark. But a baby's cry cannot be silenced by a command. The sound of Samuel crying echoed through the halls at night, a constant, piercing reminder that the sin had been committed and could not be undone. This block ends with Pendleton finding Cora standing on the balcony, looking down at the swamp. For the first time, she spoke to him directly, her voice distinct and devoid of fear. "They think they are making a dynasty," she said, gesturing to the nursery. "But they are only making a grave." It was a chilling prophecy that signaled she was no longer a passive victim, but a woman waiting for the moment the structure would collapse under its own weight. The collapse of authority began not with a rebellion, but with a stroke. In September 1855, Silas Van Holt collapsed in his library, surrounded by his charts of bloodlines and pedigrees. The tyrant who had held the madness of Blackwood Manor together with an iron fist was suddenly rendered mute and paralyzed, a prisoner in his own body. His incapacitation created a power vacuum that instantly destabilized the fragile truce between Julian and Conrad, turning the house into a battlefield. With Silas bedridden, the law of the father evaporated. Julian immediately moved to assert his dominance, seizing the keys to the safe and the ledgers. However, his authority was hollow. The servants sensed the shift, and the fear that had compelled their obedience began to fracture. Orders were ignored or carried out with agonizing slowness. The machinery of the plantation began to grind to a halt. the cotton left rotting in the fields as the chaos in the big house spilled over into the quarters. The reading of the will, or rather, the anticipation of it, became the central obsession. Rumors circulated that Silas, in his final lucid months, had rewritten his testament. Pendleton overheard Julian frantically tearing through Silas's desk, searching for a codicil he believed existed, a document that might acknowledge the natural children, or worse, leave the control of the estate to a trusteeship to prevent Julian from squandering it. The fear of disinheritance turned Julian into a cornered animal. Conrad, seeing his grandfather's weakness, tried to align himself with his father, but Julian spurned him, viewing his son as a rival rather than an heir. The house split into factions. The meals were taken separately. The silence of the corridors was replaced by the sound of slamming doors and shouted accusations. The veneer of gentility was gone. They were essentially wolves fighting over a carcass before the beast was even dead. The climax of this collapse occurred when Julian found a draft of a new will in a locked drawer. Pendleton, watching from the shadows of the hallway, witnessed the scene. Julian read the document, his face turning purple with rage. He did not summon a lawyer. Instead, he threw the papers into the fireplace. Pendleton records the crackle of the flames as the only sound in the room, witnessing the destruction of the legal order. Julian turned, his eyes wild, and declared, "I am the law now." But burning the paper did not burn the reality. The ghost children were still there, and with Silas gone, their status was in limbo. Were they property to be inherited, or liabilities to be liquidated? Julian's gaze upon them changed from possessiveness to calculation. He no longer saw them as his stamp or his father's mirror. He saw them as evidence that could destroy his reputation if he ever tried to re-enter society. Cora sensed the shift immediately. The protection of the grandfather's whim was gone. She moved the children into a single room, barricading the door at night. The authority that had exploited her had also, in a twisted way, preserved her and the children as valuable specimens. Now, under Julian's chaotic reign, that protection was gone. They were merely loose ends in a legacy that Julian wanted to sanitize. Pendleton notes a disturbing conversation with Dr. Thorne, who visited the paralyzed Silas. Thorne warned Julian, "The county knows, Julian. You cannot hide 3 generations of faces. If Silas dies, the creditors will come, and they will inventory everything." The threat of external authority, creditors, the sheriff, the public eye, pressed in on Julian, accelerating his panic. The collapse was happening from within and without. This section ends with the death of Silas Van Holt on a stormy Tuesday. There was no mourning, only a terrifying release of tension. As the body was carried out, Julian locked the front gates and loaded his pistols. The king was dead, and the prince was mad. The collapse of authority was total, leaving the estate in a state of anarchy where the only rule was survival. In the chaotic interim between Silas's death and the funeral, Arthur Pendleton sought refuge in the solitude of the schoolroom, trying to pack his belongings to flee. It was there, while prying up a loose floorboard to retrieve a dropped pen, that he discovered the iron box. This was not a documented archive of the Van Holt men, but a secret repository belonging to Cora, hidden in the one place no one looked, under the feet of the grandson she was forced to endure. Inside the rusted tin box were not coins or stolen trinkets, but a collection of objects that completely reframed the narrative of the abuse: 3 velvet-lined lockets and a bundle of dried flowers. Pendleton opened the first locket to find a lock of grey hair and a slip of paper dated 1841, signed S. The second contained a dark curl, dated 1850, signed J. The third, a pale wisp, dated 1854, signed C. These were not spoils of war taken by a victim. They were gifts given by suitors. The realization hit Pendleton with the force of a physical blow. The Van Holt men had not simply taken Cora by brute force. They had courted her. In their twisted, narcissistic delusion, they needed her to participate in the fantasy. They brought her gifts, wrote her notes, sought her favor. They needed her not just to submit, but to validate them, to choose them. It revealed a pathetic, terrifying psychological dependency. They were desperate for the approval of the very woman they held in bondage. The box also contained a small diary, written in a crude but legible hand, evidence that Cora had been taught to read, likely by Silas himself, another secret violation of the law. The entries were sparse but devastating. "He brings me silk to hide the chains," she wrote of Silas. "He brings me perfume to cover the smell of whiskey," she wrote of Julian. "He brings me toys to prove he is a man," she wrote of Conrad. The diary was a chronicle of their weakness, viewed through the eyes of the one person who saw them naked in soul and body. This discovery shifted Pendleton's understanding of Cora from a passive victim to a master of psychological survival. She had kept these tokens not out of sentiment, but as insurance, proof of their complicity, proof that they had treated her as a mistress, not a slave, when it suited them. The hidden source revealed that Cora held the power of the truth. She knew that their vanity was their Achilles' heel, and she had played the role they demanded to keep her children alive. The lockets also destroyed the Narcissus theory in part, or rather, deepened it. They didn't just want to see themselves, they wanted the mirror to smile back. The horror was in the intimacy of the violence. It was a domestic grotesquerie where violation was dressed up as romance, and the victim was forced to play along to prevent the monster from showing its teeth. Pendleton realized that this box was the lever that could topple the house. If these tokens were revealed, they would prove that the men were not masterful patriarchs, but lonely, pathetic predators begging for affection from their own property. It stripped away the myth of their power. The discovery also explained Cora's silence. She wasn't silent out of fear, she was silent because she was gathering ammunition. She was waiting for the moment when the weight of their own gifts would crush them. The box was a dossier of their emotional fragility. This block concludes with Pendleton returning the box to its hiding place, his hands trembling. He understood now that the final confrontation would not be fought with guns, but with the devastating exposure of the family's pathetic need. Cora was not just the mother of their children, she was the keeper of their shame. The funeral of Silas Van Holt was set for a Friday, but on Thursday night, Julian made the decision that would trigger the end. Panic-stricken by the debts Silas had left behind and the looming scandal of the ghost children, Julian decided to cleanse the estate. He summoned a slave trader named Mr. Greer from Mobile, known for his discretion and his willingness to handle sensitive stock. Julian's plan was simple and monstrous. He would sell Cora and the 3 children, Elijah, Lydia, and Samuel, downriver to separate plantations, erasing the evidence of the family's sins in one transaction. Pendleton's diary records the moment the decision was announced at dinner. Julian, drunk and manic, declared, "Tomorrow we start fresh. No more shadows in the halls." He spoke of selling his own brother, his own daughter, and his own grandson and brother, as if they were old furniture. It was the ultimate act of dehumanization, a frantic attempt to monetize the very mirrors they had spent decades cultivating. The reaction of Conrad was the catalyst for the final rupture. The young man, who had tried so hard to be cruel like his father, crumbled. The prospect of his son, Samuel, being sold, and perhaps the lingering, twisted attachment he felt to Cora, broke his resolve. He pleaded with his father, arguing that they were blood, that they couldn't be sold like cattle. Julian struck him across the face, shouting, "They are 0 in the ledger, they are nothing." Pendleton, listening from the hallway, describes the sickening clarity of the moment. The zero value from the probate record was now being used as a justification for erasure. If they were worth nothing, they could be discarded. But to Conrad, and in the unspoken reality of the house, they were everything. The conflict wasn't about money. It was about the collision between the legal fiction of slavery and the biological reality of family. Cora was informed of the sale, not by Julian, but by the silence of the house and the arrival of the trader's wagon in the courtyard. Pendleton saw her watching from the window, her face unreadable, but he noted that she did not pack, she did not weep. She went to the hiding place of the iron box. The decision for action had been forced upon her. She could no longer play the survival game. The game was over. Pendleton justified his own decision to intervene in his journal. "I can no longer be a witness," he wrote. "To watch this is to be an accomplice." Decide he planned to confront Julian, to threaten him with the exposure of the diaries. But before he could act, he realized that the machinery of destruction was already moving too fast. The tension in the house was a physical weight pressing down on the chest. The decision for decisive action also refers to Julian's fatal error. By deciding to sell them, he broke the unspoken pact he had with Cora. "I provide the children. You provide the protection." By removing the protection, he released her from her silence. He underestimated the rage of a mother who had endured 3 generations of violation only to see her offspring threatened with oblivion. The night air was thick with the smell of ozone and approaching rain. The trader, Greer, sat in the parlor drinking Julian's brandy, laughing about the cargo he would take in the morning. Upstairs, the nursery was silent. Downstairs, Conrad was weeping in the library, a gun on the table, paralyzed by cowardice. This section ends with Pendleton seeing Cora descending the main staircase, dressed not in her servant's clothes, but in the black silk mourning dress of the late mistress. She was moving toward the dining room, where Julian and the trader sat. She had decided to attend the dinner to which she had never been invited. The time for hiding was past. The time for the blood to speak had arrived. The final entry of Arthur Pendleton's diary is a chaotic, ink-stained scrawl written in the frantic hours after midnight, documenting the event that became known in local legend as the Dinner of Ash. It describes the scene in the dining room: Julian Van Holt at the head of the table, the slave trader Greer at his right, and Conrad slumped in a chair, drunk and weeping. The atmosphere was celebratory for Julian, who believed he had solved his problem. Then the doors opened. Cora entered. She did not come alone. She led the 3 children, Elijah, 14, Lydia, 4, and the infant Samuel in her arms. They were dressed in the finest clothes found in the attic, looking like miniature nobles. The visual impact was a physical blow. The Van Holt eye stared out from 3 faces, appearing in the lamplight like a constellation of accusations. Elijah looked so much like the portrait of Silas behind him that the trader Greer choked on his drink. Julian stood up, furious, shouting for her to leave. "Get back to the quarters," he screamed, but Cora did not flinch. She placed the iron box on the table. She opened it and poured the lockets and dried flowers onto the white tablecloth. "You paid for us," she said, her voice clear and devastatingly calm. "With these. You cannot sell what you have already bought with your souls." The trader, Greer, looked from the children to the portraits and then to Julian. The resemblance was undeniable. The horror of the twisted tangle, the father, the son, the grandson, all represented in the faces of the children, was too grotesque even for a man who traded in human flesh. "I cannot take this stock, Mr. Van Holt," Greer stammered, standing up. This is your own blood. This is unnatural." Julian's reality shattered. His attempt to treat them as anonymous property had failed because the biology was too loud. Enraged by the humiliation, by the trader's refusal, and by Cora's defiance, Julian drew a pistol. "If I cannot sell them, I will erase them," he screamed, aiming at the children who wore his own face. It was Conrad who moved, the weak, vacillating grandson, seeing his father aim a gun at his own son, Samuel, and his siblings, finally snapped. He lunged across the table, not to save them, but to stop the madness. The struggle was brief and brutal. The gun went off, shattering the oil lamp in the center of the table. The flame caught the tablecloth instantly, then the heavy velvet drapes. The dry, old wood of the manor, soaked in years of polish and neglect, ignited like kindling. The fire spread with supernatural speed, as if the house itself was eager to die. Pendleton records the chaos, the screaming, the smoke, the trader fleeing into the night. In the confusion, Julian and Conrad were trapped by a falling beam, locked in a final, hateful embrace, fighting each other while the fire consumed the legacy they had fought over. Pendleton, choking on smoke, saw Cora amidst the flames. She was not panicking. She was leading the children toward the French doors, shielding them with her body. She did not look back at the men screaming her name. She stepped out into the rain, the only survivor of the dynasty that mattered. The final image Pendleton describes is of the manor glowing like a furnace against the night sky, the portraits of the Van Holt men curling and melting, their eyes disappearing into black bubbles. The diary entry ends abruptly. The house is gone. The ledgers are ash. The only truth that remains is walking into the swamp, carrying the future. The immediate consequences of the fire at Blackwood Manor were recorded in the Montgomery Advertiser on October 12, 1855. The report detailed the total destruction of the estate and the deaths of Julian and Conrad Van Holt, whose bodies were found in the ruins of the dining room, burned beyond recognition. The official cause was listed as accidental. A lantern overturned during a domestic dispute, a sanitized explanation that hinted at the tragedy but concealed the horror. The probate court closed the file on the Van Holt estate 3 months later. The land was seized by creditors and eventually sold off in parcels. The human property listed in the inventory, Cora and the 3 children, were officially listed as missing presumed dead in the fire. The zero-value asset had vanished, taking the shame of the family with her. The Van Holt name, as a legitimate social entity, ceased to exist in Alabama. However, a different kind of document tells the true story of the legacy. A train manifest from the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, dated 2 weeks after the fire, lists a Mrs. C. Holt traveling north to Philadelphia with 3 children. The ticket was paid for with gold coins, likely the hoard Silas kept in the library, or perhaps the jewelry Julian had given her, finally put to its intended use, purchasing freedom. In the North, the traces become fainter but traceable for the historian looking for the Van Holt face. Census records from 1860, in a free black community in Philadelphia, list a Cora Holt living with 3 children, Elijah, Lydia, and Samuel. They are listed as mulatto, employed as seamstresses and laborers. They lived in obscurity, safe from the legacy that had tried to consume them. The biological legacy, however, could not be erased. The children grew up, married, and had children of their own. The Van Holt eye and the sharp, aristocratic features of the dynasty continued to appear in their descendants, a genetic echo of the men who had owned their ancestors. But in this new context, the features were not a curse of vanity. They were a badge of survival. The bloodline of Silas Van Holt survived only in the people he had dehumanized. Pendleton himself disappeared from history after depositing his journals in a university archive in Boston, with instructions that they remain sealed for a century. His testimony remained buried, a time capsule of the horror, while the official history of the South glossed over the unpleasantness of families like the Van Holts. The neighbors in Alabama eventually forgot the details, but the land retained the memory. The ruins of Blackwood Manor became a place to be avoided, a spot where the swamp reclaimed the bricks and the roses grew wild and thorny. Locals whispered that if you stood there at night, you didn't hear ghosts screaming. You heard the sound of a mirror shattering over and over again. The consequences were total. The white lineage, obsessed with purity and power, had extinguished itself in a frenzy of narcissism. The black lineage, born of violation and resilience, had walked out of the fire to build a future. The irony was absolute. The only true Van Holts left on earth were the ones who were never meant to inherit the name. The story of Cora and the Van Holt dynasty is more than a Gothic horror. It is a forensic examination of the pathology of power. The documents reveal that the greatest monstrosities are often not committed by madmen in dungeons, but by wealthy men in libraries who view other human beings as biological capital. The Van Holts believed they were playing God, curating a superior race within their own walls, but they were merely breeding their own destruction. History is often written by the victors, but in this case the victors were the ones who survived. The 1870 photograph found in the Philadelphia archives serves as the final, silent testimony. It shows an older Cora seated in a chair, looking directly at the camera with a gaze of unshakable calm. Around her stand Elijah, Lydia, and Samuel, handsome, well-dressed, and unmistakably Van Holts. They possess the face of the oppressor, but the spirit of the mother who saved them. This case forces us to confront the uncomfortable truths of the past, the secrets hidden in the zero-value columns of old ledgers, the bloodlines that were tangled by force, and the families that were destroyed by their own vanity. It reminds us that legality is not morality, and that the silence of the archives often hides the loudest screams. The Van Holt bloodline technically thrives today, likely woven into families who have no idea of the dark origin of their distinctive green eyes. The project of Silas Van Holt succeeded in the most perverse way possible. His image is preserved, but only in the descendants of the woman he enslaved. Justice, in this story, was not found in a courtroom, but in the survival of the victims and the erasure of the masters. But one question remains, echoing from the ruins of Blackwood Manor. If Arthur Pendleton hadn't written his diary, if Cora hadn't saved the lockets, this entire story would be nothing more than a gap in a census record. How many other stories like this are buried in the charred remains of American plantations? How many other dynasties dissolved into silence, leaving behind children who carried the truth in their faces, unrecognized by history? The ashes of Blackwood are cold, but the eyes are still watching. Does knowing the truth about the Van Holt legacy change how you view the silence of history records? Do you believe there are other open secrets like this still waiting to be uncovered? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this deep dive into the shadows of the past captivated you, please subscribe to Before the Story and turn on notifications. We exhume the truth that others want buried. Share this video with someone who needs to know. Sleep well, if you can.